Earlier this year, Florida State University announced it was offering freshmen accepted for this fall the option of taking a gap year. FSU also said they had $50,000 in scholarship money to assist students in their ventures during that year off. Students who apply for FSU's gap year option will be considered for a scholarship of up to $5,000. That makes FSU one of just 2 public universities in the country to offer a financial incentive for students. Now, this week, we learned President Obama's daughter, Malia, is taking a year off after graduating from high school before attending Harvard as part of a gap year program. Joining us now to talk about this growing trend is author and educator Arvin Vora. Arvin, you founded a school that strongly encourages taking a gap year. What's the thought process behind that and the goal, ultimately?
The goal is we want our students to do the most that they can. And that requires knowing what's out there. And it also requires knowing what's inside of you. If, for example, you have some great creative idea, you have a business that you might want to start, you have a language that you think you might be able to learn independently, you want to explore, those are the things that you can do in a gap year. And the 2 things that often happen is either students learn that they can do a lot even outside of the college system entirely, or they can take the most advantage of their college experience because they've seen really what they want to do.
It sort of sounds like you're rebranding the gap year as a significant educational opportunity.
It absolutely is. And one of the things that we've seen is that people who have the ability to learn independently, to explore independently, that have that sort of gumption and get up and go, are the ones who become most successful in life. But we don't think that's just an inborn quality. That's something that can be learned, and a gap year is a great time to learn that.
Are you hearing more talk about gap years now that Malia Obama is planning to take one?
There's been a bit of an uptick. There's definitely been a bit of an uptick because of that. But it's been a growing trend. I would say that Malia is actually part of an ongoing trend. Maybe not the person who started the trend, but it certainly created a boost.
My understanding is it's pretty common in Europe and Australia, but it's sort of just picking up here in the United States.
It's picked up quite a bit, I would say, over the last several years. We're not as popular. It's not as popular here as it is in Europe yet, but I really think that's going to be changing. I think one of the driving forces behind it is the huge economic cost of colleges. Many people are going to want to consider what they can do outside of the college system, whether it's taking professional exams, starting a business. All of those things are driving more and more people to consider a gap year option.
Now, I hear a lot about these gap year programs which involve traveling. Are gap years something that's only accessible to people like Malia Obama who are wealthier than the average American?
Absolutely not. There are some types of gap year programs that are more expensive. If your gap year is traveling all around Europe, that's going to cost some money. But what if your gap year is, for example, studying for the actuarial exam? That's something that if you pass it, basically guarantees you financial sector employment for life. What if your gap year is working on your own novel? That doesn't require any extra money. What if your gap year is independently learning a language or studying for the U.S. Foreign Service exam? I mean, there's so many things that you can do that are incredible academic experiences that are basically free. But they don't have to be academic. They can be creative, they can be entrepreneurial, they can be artistic. There's so many different options that really don't cost a lot of money, and many don't cost any money at all.
And some parents, at first thought might say, I don't want you staying home. You might not pursue your education if you take a year off. I don't want you sitting on the couch at home. But it sounds like it's really changing a lot of people's idea of what a gap year is, whether it's a program or, as you said, exploring entrepreneurial opportunities. Are there any studies, I know it's somewhat of a new trend, but are there any studies out there that point out pros or cons of gap years?
I think probably the biggest publicly known, the most of the data on gap year kind of tells you what people do before and after, and there's some indication that people who do gap years end up being more responsible, but sometimes they just might have been more responsible beforehand. I think one of the most compelling stories is the story of Peter Thiel, as the founder of PayPal, who started a scholarship that basically is a $50,000 a year scholarship to have basically a 2-year gap year. And what he wants people to do is to see what you can do without college. See what you can do on your own. And the fact that you have people like that who believe that their success happened despite, in his case, his Stanford education, not because of it, really, I believe, is driving this trend.
So a 2-year gap year. Now, does
That's
that
the
look
Teal
bad?
Scholarship, absolutely.
Does that look bad on a resume, or if you're trying to get into school, are they going to wonder what did you do with your life for 2 years ultimately?
We've worked with many students who have first gotten into college, then taken a gap year. We've also worked with many students who have first taken 1 or 2 years off and then gone back to college. And what really makes the difference is, what did you do during that gap year? If you took 2 years to start an internet company that's now successful, that's not going to hurt your chances. In fact, that's going to make you stand out because it'll make you look different from other applicants, more interesting, add to the intellectual diversity of the college. Now, if you take 2 years to sit on the couch, that's really going to hurt your application. So it really depends what you do at that time.
So it depends on what you do. Now, if you wanted to take a gap year, you mentioned you apply for school, get accepted, and then take a couple years off, or how would that work?
There's many different ways that people do their gap years. Some people do a gap year where they don't apply to college as seniors. They do 1 or 2 or sometimes even more years off. And it's not just years off, it's years where they're really actually actively engaged, sometimes more actively engaged than they have ever been in their entire lives. And then they apply. But you can also do it the other way, which is you first apply to college, then you defer your admission for a year. And that's something that's available at a huge number of colleges. Not all, so you should probably check before, but it's a very commonly available option that many people use to explore the artistic and entrepreneurial, business, and other academic endeavors during a year off.
So there's lots of different ways we could go about it. One final question I've got to ask you. Could we see this trend expand into the working generation? Could you or I take a gap year off? That's what I want to know.
I mean, I think it already has existed for a long time. I mean, that's what a sabbatical essentially is. It's a gap year, sometimes a couple even 1 or 2 gap years. And it's really, I think, a question of what you do during that time. There's so many people who have a small business that's kind of on the side, and they say, well, maybe I could turn this small business that's kind of on the side into the primary thing that I do. And that was my own experience as an entrepreneur. There's so many people that have this great creative idea, maybe a story, a play, a screenplay that they want to write. And that's something they can also do during that time off. There's some people who just want to take some time to really reconnect with their own vision of life. What do they want to do with their lives? And I think that's something that you absolutely can do. Now, the main difference is, if you're an adult, you probably have to support yourself, so you have to make sure your finances are in order. But if you can, and especially if you do it abroad in a country where spending a year not working doesn't actually cost that much money, there's amazing things that you can do with a gap year, even as an adult.
Certainly lots to think about, and Malia Obama has really given the gap year a whole new level of recognition. Arvin, thanks so much for joining us today to talk about this new trend in higher education.
Thanks so much for having me on.